The call came in at 7:43 on a Thursday morning. Right as I was, parallel parking on Bloor Street with a coffee wedged between my knees. I almost didn't answer. I never answer numbers I don't recognize before 9. But something, I don't know what, maybe the fact that it had already called twice, made me pick up. "Is this Nell?" The voice on the other end was a woman's, older, professionally careful in the way hospital staff sometimes are. "Nell Ashby? Speaking. This is St. Michael's. We have your father here. He was brought in this morning. He's stable, but you're listed as his emergency contact." I sat in my car for a long time after that call ended. Long enough that someone knocked on my window to tell me I was blocking the bike lane. Long enough that my coffee went cold. My father had been gambling again. I already knew before the attending physician said it. I knew from the way my aunt had been leaving me 3-minute voicemails that ended abruptly, like she'd run out of courage. I knew from the fact that my father had not answered his phone in 6 weeks, and that his landlord had emailed me, his 31-year-old daughter, his emergency contact for everything, including, apparently, the consequences of his own choices, asking about back rent. My father's gambling was not new. It was the oldest thing in my life, older than my memories of him being sober, older than my mother's departure when I was 9. What was new was the number the doctor mentioned quietly, as if lowering his voice would soften it. $340,000. I asked him to repeat it. He did. $340,000 in debt to a man named Harwick, not a casino, not a bookmaker with a website, a man. The kind of man, the doctor said carefully, who had apparently sent 2 other men to my father's apartment to communicate the urgency of repayment. My father had a fractured wrist and 2 cracked ribs. I drove to St. Michael's. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. He always did, in the places his choices had put him, smaller and younger and genuinely sorry in the way that only ever lasted until it didn't. He reached for my hand when I came in and I let him take it because he was my father, and he was in a hospital bed and whatever else I felt, I still felt that. "Nell," he said, "I'm going to fix it. How? I've got a plan." I sat in the plastic chair beside his bed. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular institutional sadness of fluorescent lighting. I waited. He told me about a man named Harwick. He told me, in the circling way of someone who knows they're confessing something unforgivable, that the debt had started 2 years ago, and that he had borrowed against it, and that Harwick, unlike a bank, had a particular way of collecting. But, my father said, there's a way out. He said it the way he always said things like that. Like the universe had provided, like this was good news. The way out, he explained, was a man named Whitmore. Not Carl Whitmore. I checked the name list 3 times before I let myself keep going. A different man entirely. His name was Leighton Whitmore. He was 44 years old. He ran a private equity firm out of a glass tower on Bay Street, and had, apparently, some business arrangement with Harwick that my father did not fully understand, and had not bothered to fully investigate before agreeing to it. The arrangement was this. Leighton Whitmore would absorb my father's debt entirely. In exchange, he wanted a meeting with me. "A meeting," I repeated. "He's seen your work," my father said. "You're good at what you do. He probably just wants, Dad, a professional arrangement, Dad." He stopped. "You gave him my name," I said. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. I left the hospital without saying goodbye. I sat in my car in the parking garage on Bond Street, and I stared at the concrete pillar in front of me, and I thought about how I was 31 years old with a master's degree and a firm I'd built from a spare bedroom in my Leslieville apartment, and my father had handed my name to a stranger to cover the cost of his own stupidity. I thought about calling my lawyer. I thought about calling my therapist. I thought about driving to my father's apartment, collecting his mail, and never speaking to him again. Then I thought about $340,000. Then I called the number my father had left on a post-it note in my coat pocket, which meant he'd put it there before the hospital, before the phone call, before all of it. He'd been carrying that note around, waiting. The line picked up on the second ring. "Miss Ashby," said a voice. Male, unhurried. The voice of someone who had been expecting this call, and had decided in advance not to be interesting about it. "I wondered when you'd reach out." "I haven't agreed to anything," I said. "No," he said. "Not yet. I researched Leighton Whitmore the way I research everything, methodically, with 3 browser tabs open and a legal pad for notes. What I found was not reassuring, but was also not, I had to admit, what I'd feared. He was 44. Born in Halifax, educated at Dalhousie and then LSE. His firm, Whitmore Capital, managed roughly $2 billion in private assets, with a focus on distressed acquisitions. Companies that were failing, that he bought for very little and rebuilt or dismantled, depending on what made financial sense. His record was not warm, but it was clean. No fraud charges. No regulatory investigations. His name appeared in the Globe and Mail 12 times in the last 3 years, always in the business section, always in the context of transactions that sounded bloodless and enormous. He was photographed at a gala for Kids in 2024. Dark jacket, no tie, expression of a man who would rather be somewhere else, but had decided to be courteous about it. I studied that photograph longer than I needed to. I did not find anything that explained why he wanted a meeting with me. I went to his office on a Tuesday. It was on the 38th floor of a building on Bay Street that had the kind of lobby designed to make you feel slightly underdressed, even if you were wearing your good blazer. I was wearing my good blazer. I felt slightly underdressed. His assistant, whose name was Geneva, and who had the preternatural calm of someone who has seen everything and judged none of it, brought me to a corner office with a view that encompassed most of the financial district, and, on a clear day, probably the lake. Leighton Whitmore was standing at the window when I came in. He turned when he heard the door. In the photograph from the gala he had looked composed. In person he looked like composure was something he'd worked at, like a second language. He was taller than I'd expected, the kind of man who takes up the right amount of space without seeming to try. "Ms. Ashby," he said. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't have a lot of options," I said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, an acknowledgement. "Sit," he said. "Please." He did not sit immediately himself, which I noticed. He moved to the other side of the desk, with the deliberateness of someone who has learned to be careful with themselves. Then he sat, and he folded his hands on the desk, and he looked at me in the way people look at things they've been thinking about for a long time. "Your firm," he said. "Ashby Studio. You did the Dundas West mixed-use project." "I did. And the adaptive reuse on Queen East, the one that was supposed to be a parking structure." "That's right. I had someone walk through it last month." He paused. "They said it felt like the building had always wanted to be something else." "I didn't know what to do with that," I said. "What do you actually want, Mr. Whitmore?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have a property in the Muskokas. 300 acres, existing structure, completely dysfunctional for what I need it to do. I've been trying to find the right person to redesign it for 2 years." Another pause. "I've been following your work for about the same amount of time." "That's a coincidence," I said. "It isn't," he said. The room was very quiet. 38 floors below us, Bay Street moved the way it always does, urgent and indifferent. "The debt," I said. "My father's debt." "You're saying you'll clear it?" "Yes. In exchange for a design contract." He looked at me carefully. "In exchange for you taking the project. That's the same thing." "It isn't," he said again. "A contract can be broken. I'm asking you to take the project, to see it through." I thought about the parking structure on Queen East, about the first time I'd walked through that building alone, before the demolition teams came, when it was still just a concrete shell with pigeons in the upper levels, and someone's old mattress on the second floor, about the way I'd stood in the middle of it and seen, not what it was, but what it could be. "I'll need to see the property," I said. "Of course, and I'll need full creative authority. I don't design by committee, I understand, and I need it in writing. Not your word, a contract." "Already drafted," he said. He said it the way you say something you've been sitting on. I looked at him. "You were very certain I'd come." "No," he said. And this time the thing at the corner of his mouth was definitely not a smile. "I was very hopeful. I took the project. I told myself it was a business decision. I told myself that the Muskoka property, which turned out to be a 90-year-old lakefront lodge that had been run as a wilderness retreat in the 70s, and then left to the slow patience of the Canadian winter for the last 2 decades, was exactly the kind of project I'd been trying to get for years. Adaptive reuse at scale, complete structural assessment, the kind of thing you put on the first page of your firm's profile. I told myself all of this, and I almost believed it. The first site visit was in October. Leighton drove, which surprised me. I'd expected a driver, expected the particular remove of a man with $2 billion under management. But he pulled up to my office building in a dark green Land Cruiser that had mud on the wheel wells and a travel mug in the cup holder, and offered to stop at Tim's on the 400 if I needed coffee. I said I was fine. We didn't talk much on the drive up. He asked me a few questions about the Queen East project that were specific enough to be genuine. Not the polite questions of someone trying to fill silence, but the questions of someone who had done their homework and wanted to fill in the gaps. I answered them. I asked him about the lodge. He told me it had been in his family briefly, bought by his grandfather in 1987, and sold to pay for something he didn't specify, then acquired Whitmore Capital through a distressed sale 3 years ago. Personal project? I asked. Something like that, he said. We drove the rest of the way in silence that was, after a while, not uncomfortable. The lodge was extraordinary. That was the first thing I felt when we came through the tree line and I saw it. Not professional assessment, just plain response, the way your body reacts before your brain catches up. It sat at the edge of the lake, like it had grown there. The original structure was hand-hewn timber and local stone, the kind of craftsmanship that doesn't happen anymore. Buried under 40 years of bad additions and deferred maintenance, and a roof that had given up on 3 of its sections entirely. I stood on the dock with my notebook and my camera, and I forgot for a while about the debt and the hospital, and my father, and Leighton Whitmore standing 20 feet behind me. When I turned around, he was watching. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That whoever built this original structure knew what they were doing," I said, "and that everyone who touched it afterward didn't. Can it be saved?" I looked at it. The light was coming across the lake in the particular way it does in October, low and gold, and the lodge caught it in a way that made the bad additions disappear. "Yes," I said, "but it's going to take time." "I have time," he said. It took 4 months of site visits before I understood that he came every time. Not every site visit. I had my team up there twice a month through the winter, structural engineers and a heritage consultant, and my junior associate Mabel, who had the gift of seeing load-bearing potential in things that looked terminal. But every time I went, Leighton was there, not in the way of someone checking on an investment, in the way of someone who wanted to be there. He learned to stay out of the way. He brought good coffee, not Tim's, eventually, but a thermos of something from a place on King Street that I hadn't heard of and that turned out to be extremely good. And he stood in corners and watched me work and didn't interrupt unless I spoke to him first. He had opinions, but he held them carefully, offering them only when asked, and they were almost always interesting. In February, when we were doing the demo on the bad addition off the north wing, he handed me a sledgehammer. "Do you want to?" he said. It wasn't a question. I looked at the wall. 40 years of someone else's bad idea. "Yes," I said. I swung the sledgehammer twice, and Mabel took a video that I did not post anywhere, but that I have watched approximately 15 times since. Afterward, standing in the cold and the plaster dust, Leighton said, "You look like you needed that. Everyone needs that sometimes." I said, "What's your usual target?" he said. "Parking structures," I said, and he laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh. It rearranged something in the room. I started calling him Leighton sometime around March. I don't remember when exactly. He had been calling me Nell since February, which I had not corrected, and it had become the kind of uncorrected thing that becomes its own decision. He started calling me something else in March. We were reviewing the revised elevation drawings at the site table, a plywood sheet on sawhorses that had become our unofficial office, and I was explaining why I wanted to take the addition off entirely and restore the original roofline, and he was listening in that way of his, completely attentive, and when I finished, he said, "Sparrow." I looked up. "What? You tilt your head when you're explaining something you care about," he said, like a bird listening to something underground. I didn't know what to do with that. I looked back at the drawings. "Is that a compliment?" I said. "Yes," he said, very simply, the way he said things that were true. He called me Sparrow after that, which I also did not correct. I found out about the other thing in April. Mabel found it first, actually, going through the property records for the heritage application. She brought it to me on a Thursday afternoon, with the look of someone who wasn't sure how to hand over something fragile. Leighton Whitmore had purchased Ashby Studios' line of credit. Not the firm itself. My line of credit, the operational debt I'd carried since my second year, standard for a small firm, unremarkable, the kind of thing you manage and don't think about. It had been sold, without my knowledge or consent, by the original lender, to a holding company that turned out, after Mabel spent 2 hours cross-referencing corporate registrations, to be a subsidiary of Whitmore Capital. He had been my quiet creditor for 8 months. He could have called that credit at any time. He hadn't. I drove to his office. I did not call ahead. I parked in the Bay Street garage and I walked through the lobby, and I took the elevator to 38 and I told Geneva, whose preternatural calm remained absolutely intact, that I needed 5 minutes. She looked at me. She looked at whatever was on my face. She said, "I'll let him know you're here." He was in a meeting. He came out of it in 4 minutes. He looked at me and he said, "You found out about the credit facility." Not a question. "Yes," I said. "Come in," he said. I came in. I did not sit down. I stood in the middle of that corner office with its 38th floor view, and I said, "Explain." He sat on the edge of his desk. He was quiet for a moment, which was his way of choosing words carefully. "When I found your firm," he said, "it was 18 months ago. Your original lender was selling off a portfolio of small business debt. Your file came across my desk, and you bought it. Yes? Why?" He looked at me. "Because I'd been trying to find a reason to approach you professionally for 6 months, and I wasn't sure you'd take a cold call from someone like me." I stared at him. "That is the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know. You bought my debt because you wanted to hire me." "I bought your debt," he said carefully, "because I wanted to make sure you were protected, and because I wanted, yes, a reason to approach you. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you could have called me," I said. "I know, you could have emailed the firm." "I know, instead I know, Nell." His voice was quiet. "I know what I did. I'm not telling you it was reasonable." I looked at the window. The lake was just barely visible on a clear day. Someone had told me once. I'd never managed to see it. "Did you know about my father?" I said. "Before, did you go to him or did he find you?" A pause. "He found me," he said, "through Harwick. I didn't engineer that, but you used it." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "I need you to transfer the credit facility back," I said, "to a real lender, whatever rate I was getting before." "Done," he said immediately. "And I need to know," I said, "that the project, the lodge, is a real project, that you actually need it done." "I do," he said. "I wouldn't have." He stopped. "I want that building to be what it should have been. That part has always been true." I stood there for a long time. "I'm going to need a week," I said finally. He nodded. "I'm not going to make any decisions about the project until I've thought about it." "Of course. And I need you to understand," I said, "that I built this firm on my own, without anyone's help or anyone's protection. Whatever you thought you were doing, I didn't need it." "I know," he said. "That's part of why. I left. I spent a week doing the thing I always do when I need to think. I worked. I drove up to the lodge alone, with Mabel's drawings and my own notebook and the particular stillness of a Muskoka April, the ice just off the lake, the light coming back. I walked through every room of what we'd uncovered so far. The original great room with its timber frame, the stone fireplace that turned out to be structurally perfect, the east wing that had been hidden under a drop ceiling for 40 years, and turned out to have the highest windows in the building, full of the kind of indirect north light that you cannot manufacture. I thought about a man who had bought my debt because he wanted, in some overcomplicated way, to make sure I was okay, who had spent 6 months trying to find a reason to talk to me, who drove his own car and brought good coffee and handed me a sledgehammer in February, because he could see that I needed to break something. I thought about my father in the hospital bed, reaching for my hand. I thought about the difference between someone who takes from you and someone who miscalculates how to give. On the 4th day, I called Leighton. He answered on the 2nd ring, the way he always did. "The north windows," I said. "The ones in the east wing. I want to take them to the ceiling. Original height, no headers. We'll use a steel lintel to carry the load. The light in that room is going to be..." "Nell," he said. His voice was careful. "I'm not done being angry," I said. "I know, but the project is the project," I said. "And I don't walk away from buildings." A pause, then, "Okay, and we're going to need to talk," I said. "About the other part, about what you actually..." I stopped. "About all of it. Yes, he said. Whenever you're ready. I'm not ready yet. Whenever, he said again. And he meant it, which was somehow the worst and best part. We had the conversation in July, on the dock at the lodge at the end of a long sight day. The east wing windows were framed. The roofline was back to its original pitch. The building was starting to look like itself, like it had always wanted to be something else and had finally been permitted to try. We sat on the dock with our feet not quite reaching the water and the last light going pink over the lake, and I said, "Why didn't you just tell me you wanted to meet me?" "Because," he said, after a moment, "I didn't know what to say." "That's surprising," I said. "You seem like someone who always knows what to say." "I know what to say in rooms I understand," he said. "Boardrooms. Negotiations. I've been in those rooms my whole life." He looked at the water. "I didn't know the rules for the other kind." "There aren't rules," I said. "I know that now." I looked at the lake. A loon called somewhere out of sight, that sound that seems like it comes from further away than it actually is. "My father is in a program," I said. "A real one this time. The debt thing. I think it scared him in a way the other times didn't." "I hope it holds," Leighton said. "I do too." I paused. "I'm not going to thank you for the thing with Harwick. I need you to understand that. That wasn't yours to fix." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to thank me." "Good. We were quiet for a while. The lodge," I said finally, "when it's done. What do you want to do with it?" He was quiet long enough that I turned to look at him. "I don't know yet," he said. "I used to think I wanted to sell it. To prove something, maybe. That I could take something broken and make it worth something. And now?" He looked at me. The light was very low, and the lake was going silver, and he looked like someone who had decided to stop being careful. "Now I think," he said slowly, "that maybe some things you restore because you want to keep them." The loon called again. I thought about the great room with its timber frame, the fireplace that had always been perfect, the north windows that would, when we were done, fill that east wing with the kind of light that makes everything in a room look like it belongs there. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. "That's a good reason," I said. "To restore something." He nodded. He didn't push it further, which was, I was learning, one of the things about him. He knew when something was an opening and when it was enough. The sun finished setting. The dock held us. The water was very still. "Sparrows," he said. "Don't," I said. But I was not telling him to stop. He knew the difference. He'd always known the difference. "Okay," he said. And we sat there in the good dark while the lodge behind us stood in the last light, patient and restored, becoming slowly, finally, what it had always been meant to be.